Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island of the City University of New York. Today we continue our 10-part series, a survey of the new Latin American cinema of the last 25 years. Today we're going to be offering something a little bit different, something quite rare indeed. We'll be showing the first part of the noted documentary Hour of the Furnaces. I say the first part because this is a very, very long work, about 4.5 hours long, so we're only seeing the first third of it. It does stand by itself and is of significant interest historically, politically, and for its filmmaking technique. It's also a very partisan piece of political filmmaking. Afterwards, we'll let you make up your mind whether you consider it an historical document, a piece of propaganda, or in fact an invitation to liberation. We'll be talking about all of those possibilities and others afterward with today's two guests, Catherine Benamou, a noted specialist in Latin American cinema, and the sociologist Héctor Schamis. Enjoy Hour of the Furnaces. Exactly about this. Hi, welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I hope you enjoyed or were intrigued by this wild, interesting, courageous, naive, maddening, there's a whole set of other things we'll be saying about documentary Hour of the Furnaces. Before we get on to all those adjectives and other things, let me introduce today's two guests. Sitting to my left is Catherine Benamou. Catherine is a curator of Latin American film. She's curated a number of exhibits and is one of the co-founders of an attempt to distribute more Latin American film, Punto de Vista Latina. She's a specialist in Latin American and Caribbean studies, has spent a great deal of time on the continent itself, and is currently doing her work in cinema studies at New York University on the radical documentary tradition in Latin America. To my right is Héctor Schamis. Héctor is a sociologist trained at the University of Buenos Aires. He's a specialist in political economy and is in fact working on the period of the 60s and the 70s. He's in the United States because he's continuing his studies at Columbia University. Héctor, you are Argentine, and you were living there at the time the film portrays and the time that the film was made. I'm curious on how you first encountered this film itself in what personal and sort of the political context also of the country.
Well, at the time, the film expressed a general climate, general political climate, not only of Argentina, but of the region in general, I would say. And of course, the way any of us could have saw the film
right.
in those years, it was much different from what we can judge today about the film. And well, it was a period of increasing political mobilization and activation of a number of groups, ideological polarization, and a number of political forces and social movements which were increasingly radicalizing by then.
Right.
And the film itself, I think, it portrays that in a good fashion.
I'm curious, this film was shot in the late 60s, but was it shown widely then, or did you see it later?
In Argentina, it wasn't shown in the late 60s because of political reasons, but from 73 to 76, between two military periods, Argentina had a democratic one, just for a brief 3 years. And it was shown I first saw it in 1973.
Oh, okay.
And I was pretty young by then, but nonetheless, I was part of the political climate of my own generation.
Right. Well, you know, one of the things that is perhaps a little bit difficult for a North American audience to understand about the film in terms of the partisan politics involved in it is just Peronism and what it's a very complicated phenomenon, but what was it in this period? Because, am I correct in saying this is a film that's coming from the Peronist left?
Right. Yeah, you could say so. The astonishing thing that happened in the late 60s was that Peronism, once a populist, center to right-oriented political movement, but again, characterized by its populist content, which is comparable with other populist contents, movements in the continent, attracted a number of left-wing people, intellectuals, and radicals, who saw in Peronism an alternative, and started to incorporate to the Peronist Party, and it entailed a number of new things that happened in Argentina, particularly in those years. Whereas in Chile, you have that activation and radicalization went on the lines of socialist or socialist-communist coalition with the Allende government. Well, you had that in Argentina that took place around or encompassed by Peronism. And it was a very weird mixture that, well, we all know how it finished years later. That was the general climate, I would say.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the cinematic climate for a minute or so. Where does this film fit in with traditions of two things? Of Argentine film, how does it fit or not fit with other things? And then with the traditions of documentary filmmaking in Latin America. Catherine.
Okay, well, this film is clearly a classic of what is called the new Latin American cinema, which was a movement which began in the 50s in Latin America and stretched through the 70s and gradually dissolved with exile, military takeovers, and different sort of configuration of financing for cinema and different social processes. What you are showing on this program is, in fact, only the first section of this film.
Right, because this is part one, and
part one.
The film does end, saying there are two other parts, right?
Yes, there are two other parts, Act for Liberation and Violence and Liberation. And this film is clearly geared toward a kind of direct intervention into political affairs, using documentary as a tool. Like other new Latin American cinema, it involved a sort of mixture of documentary techniques and then later sort of narrativizing what had been shot and assembled, and tended to look directly at the problems of poverty, social injustice, and what could be done to sort of fight one's way out of the situation of dependency and basically neocolonialism, which is what this first segment is about. The film is constructed as an essay film, which distinguishes it from other films that were made in the period, both in Argentina and elsewhere.
Right.
And
it puts it in a relationship with some films that are being made elsewhere in the world, because we did a show a season or so ago on Godard's Vivre sa vie, which is a narrative film that's then put in an essay format and comes from the same period. Sorry.
Right, right. So as a documentary, really it's a compilation of items, and the strategy corresponds to strategy which is, of course, spelled out in an essay that these directors wrote at that time, which is a manifesto as well, called Toward a Third Cinema.
Okay.
And this is one of the canonized texts of Third World cinema at that moment, where there's a belief, an optimism, I would say, in the possibility of armed struggle throughout the Third World to produce real social and economic change. There's a reference to the Tricontinental Revolution in this film, with quotes from Ho Chi Minh and Frantz Fanon, who of course
Right.
was a spokesperson for revolution in Algeria. And one sees images from the Vietnam War. I'm just quoting from yours, Evans' film, Earth and Sky, in this particular
Right.
segment. And one also sees an effort toward pan-Latin American politicization. And there is quoting as well from Leon Hertzmann's film, a Brazilian film, called Maioria Absoluta, in this particular segment.
And one other quotation, since we're rounding up our quotation segment, there is a quotation from the Fernando Birri
Yes.
a film, which is a precedent for this movement, as I take it, because Birri, who is now working, as I believe it, at the Third World, the Third World Film School, which is sponsored by a number of agencies, but is housed in Cuba. I believe he is now working as a mentor director there, and is seen as a godfather figure. I say that because he's one of the characters who, because of the nature of the fact we only have 10 shows to survey, he's one of those important characters who gets shown in the excerpt of someone else's film, not an entire film of his own.
That's right. And the segment that we see in this first segment of Hour of the Furnaces is from Thierry. And that segment really illustrates, I would say, the beginnings of New Latin American cinema, in that there's an idea that one is going to directly confront the social reality of the country and to use documentary techniques to do this. And the film is shot from a train where we see poor children getting dimes,
Right.
or Argentine dimes,
Right.
from the passengers, so that it clearly puts the relationship of classes in a documentary form. Now, as a documentary, this film, what the footage that I can determine was shot by Solanas and Getino themselves is shot, of course, in verite. That is, they took a camera, handheld, and went into a situation in a candid approach without necessarily informing the people in front of the camera
Right.
that they were being filmed, and later used post-synchronized sound on the soundtrack.
Voiceover, as we...
Voiceover combined with some ambient sound that they shot on location. The idea of location shooting and of recording both sound and image on location was very important to this phase of Latin American cinema, whether it involved fiction or documentary.
Let me just, I'd like to get Hector's opinion on part of this, and that is, when you look at this film, obviously they have chosen to show certain things about Argentina. Historically, it's not that I doubt the accuracy of much of the factual materials that they are citing, but the question that arises is, it's a selection of materials. Do you find that there is, what do you find their principles of selection, like? I mean, are there things that to you are conspicuously absent from the film, as well as certain things that are conspicuously there in the film for political reasons?
Well, in relative terms, Argentina has changed a lot in the last 15 years, I
Right.
would say. But by then, Argentina was relatively richer compared to other countries in Latin America. Nonetheless, because of political and ideological reasons and for the type of political surroundings of the film, poverty in Argentina is remarked all throughout the film. And which is, it's not a question of the existence or not of poverty, for instance, but of course anyone who would know the nature of Argentine society, especially by the end of the 60s, would have said that, well, they remarked that Argentina had a huge middle class. It was an extremely urbanized country compared to other Latin American countries. But poverty in a rural setting, in spite of 30% of the population, as the film says, being inhabitants of rural environments, is constantly in the screen.
Right.
And, well, there are political reasons for that, and they were part, as I said a moment ago, they were part of a political movement that tried to emphasize that aspect of Argentine society in those years.
Well, one of the things that interests us to me is that this is both an Argentine film, but it's a film that's also a call or a political plea for a unity not necessarily a politically organized one in the sense of everybody joins the same party, but that there should be a general movement toward liberation.
Well, that was an issue. That was the unity of Latin America was a political issue since the time of independence, and the liberators of the continent, people names like Bolivar or San Martin or many others, were for some kind of Latin American unification, if not in terms of, in political terms, in terms of shared objectives and a same destiny,
right,
so to speak. And that was subsequently retaken by a number of political movements in the continent, one of which was Peronism, and one of which was the Cuban Revolution,
right,
in '58. And that's again, you know, one common issue that allowed the occurrence of those events. I mean, the mixture of old-fashioned populism with the new events promoted by the Cuban Revolution and the neo-colonialism or anti-colonialist movements in the '60s. But that's, as you said, it's constantly remarked in the film.
Yeah, to me, the reason I brought this up is that there's a strange sort of ambivalence in the film. On the one hand, the film is very much about Argentina, yet it's using Argentina as this model of Latin America and the model of this condition and that condition. And of course, one of the points is that Argentina's history is shared with Latin America, but it's distinct in a number of ways.
Yes, but that I believe it happened because of political reasons. This film was made by the time in which Peronism was banned, and its leader, Perón himself, was in exile in Spain. And it is, in spite of all the recurrence or all the different ways the film refers to Latin America, I believe it is addressed originally to an Argentine audience.
Oh, okay.
And it's addressed to reinvigorate and to emphasize the Peronism as a political movement. And
well, that brings us to this issue of the particular conditions of production and distribution of this
Yes.
film.
Right, I would
You
like
knew
to
that.
expand, and I just wanted to expand on something he just said, because in fact, one of my criticisms of the film is that it assumes literacy of the audience. Such a central part of the film are these titles, which are ingeniously worked with graphically in terms of zoom in, zoom out, repetition on the screen, white letters against a black frame.
And very difficult to be read.
Yes, and a lot of the film's political messages are transmitted in this means, in addition to the voiceover. So that the film is presuming, in fact, is directed clearly at a certain Peronist constituency, I would say, which would be urban and working class. And the authors of the film and of the essay say in their essay that, in fact, the film was used in organizing, labor organizing, in Argentina during the time when it was banned. And they wanted it to be, to create a cinema which was as compromising for someone to make as to watch. So that by watching it, one risked, in fact, facing machine gun fire, because it was clandestinely shown. They were interested in creating a cinema which could not be recuperated by the system. That's what they called a third cinema, where one would have an integration of production, distribution, exhibition along guerrilla lines. They called the filmmaking unit a guerrilla unit. And so that one had to constantly be taking risks, both to get the shots, the material shot. In fact, we see scenes of the oligarchy in this film, and I'm not so sure the people who were being shot were aware that
that's
the use to which the image would be put.
Yes, absolutely. That's something I think one, as a spectator, is constantly aware of. Or let's put it in very, very mundane terms. Did these people sign release forms for the use of their images? You know, and of course the answer is absolutely not. This is candid camera nightmare.
Yes, and that works both ways. One of their strategies for production was to expropriate. In other words, not to ask money from the system and therefore be co-opted by some kind of production structure, certainly not the state, but to expropriate the means of production. And those means include images. and sound. So that one finds in this a sort of pastiche that goes all the way from Bach to tango to the national anthem, Aurora, to other kinds of the berimbau from Brazil and so on and so forth, which is part of the power of the film, actually. But of course, they considered their right as revolutionary filmmakers to take material from newsreels and whatever source, advertising, whatever, and to mix it into the film. Now, there is a criticism to be made even from their political position, which has to do with the cinematic strategy, and that is that if one compares a film like Battle of Chile, which of course was also shot with a direct technique, with this
Patricio
film.
Guzman.
Yes, right, and the group in Chile during Allende. And the last segment of this film, which deals with working class organizing and the students, one sees that every time a working class leader opens their mouth, they are cut off by the voiceover narration, which is going to tell you how you're going to interpret it. So there is definitely a sort of paternalistic attitude on the part of the filmmakers toward their subjects, and I would say that's extended toward the women in the film. Because in a very key segment in the last portion, we see a group of student leaders who are going to explain their strategy as Peronists and so on and so forth. There are women present.
This is the last part. This is not in the first part.
No, this is in the last chapter that you see, which is a strategy for liberation in the current time, because it reviews the years of Peronism all the way through the 50s and 60s up to the present. And here we see Peronist student leaders, and of course the women remain silent, are not asked questions, and do not speak. So that one can say that there is a relationship between form and ideology in this film, which would be critiqued in that manner from the present perspective.
Let me add a footnote, well, 2 footnotes to that. Well, about paternalism, I would say that's a constant in revolutionary movements. I mean, they know better what the masses should do. And they are those, I mean, that's in theory, and especially after the writings of Lenin, well, that's almost inevitably present in every revolutionary movement. Not in a populist movement, by the way. We should differentiate. And that's, again, going back to the idea of the mixture or the coupling of those things. And the other, about the audience, it's clear to me that despite what they said or what the filmmakers could have said, this is a film addressed to students because the labor was always Peronist in Argentina. They didn't need any film to know where their political preferences were. What was new in the 60s in Argentina was that the student movement, after being leftist for decades, became Peronist. And Peronism attracted the student movement by the end of the 60s and early 70s in a massive way. And that's precisely, I believe, one of the primary goals of the film, to address a sort of different message to a student movement, which by then, in 68, started to see in Peronism a political alternative of change. The change that the left, precisely because of the preferences of the labor movement with Peronism, the left didn't seem to provide an opportunity to political change. And they started to look at Peronism as an opportunity and as a viable option for political, social, and economic change. And that's clear in the film, I would say.
Oh, but see, that links, I think, with what Catherine was also saying about this gap, perhaps not perceived by the filmmakers, between, in some sense, what they claim they're doing in terms of an address and what's really going on, which is again connected with this contradiction you talked about, that revolutionary movements tend to be paternalistic, have an authoritarian quality to them. I mean, it's at best the trickle-down theory. We have a kind of truth. There can be claims that it's truth and it's dialectical, but it always tends to be the same thing and is to be distributed to other people.
Right. And the funny thing is that at the same time, that position allowed for 2 things. On the one hand, of course, attack capitalism as a sort of evil. But on the other one, to attack democracy, which is not based on any any sort of paternalist position. Of course, democracy has leaders and needs leaders,
Right.
but leaders don't tell the people what the people should do or should know.
Right.
Leaders are chosen by the people ultimately, and that's something that revolutions don't have usually.
No, that's a very strong point. That also means that there are the seeds of the failure that are available here. I mean, alas, we have a perspective a number of years later, and this is a film that calls for liberation, and that were not its consequences.
Well, it was a time. Forgive me my bias, of course.
Yeah.
But, it was a time of dependency theory in the continent,
Right.
which, departing from some of the writings of Lenin about imperialism, came up with a whole body of literature, with a full-fledged model of liberation. And the dependency theory argued that Latin America was a backward continent, and the reason why Latin America was backward was because it was dependent on some other external source of power, monopoly capital, the United States, whoever. And that certainly is reflected in this film, is reflected in the political climate of the time. Nobody talks today in almost, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but few people talk about dependencia today in Latin America.
Right.
The issues is democracy, the consolidation of democracy, and dependent or non-dependent. It's much better. Even the left today says
Right.
being dependent or not, it's much better to have democracy than not having democracy.
And to make those decisions of self-constitution and of self-direction within that context.
Definitely.
Yeah, okay. That leads us to this question of another context, the political and the cinematic. I mean, this is the person we most associate with this film is Fernando Solanas.
Yes, that's right.
Who is a continued presence in the Argentine cinema. He's also someone who, as a consequence of the military government and his politics, spent a great deal of time in exile in the 70s, along with many people. What has happened to Solanas as a filmmaker and in terms of his own image? I mean, his later films and what view he has of his own earlier work.
Okay, in all fairness to Solanas, and I think that Hector would agree with me,
Yes.
he has revised his position as a consequence of the Peronist failure in the early 70s. And in fact, he was a Peronist of the left and was exiled even though he was a Peronist after Isabel Perón came into power with the military. So I would say that in terms of his films, it's very interesting what has happened. I see both continuities, strong continuities, and radical differences. The continuities are that he always tried to incorporate theater into cinema. The second portion of The Furnaces is act for liberation. The idea was that the spectator should become an actor in his own situation. They would stop the film as an interrupted spectacle and have a discussion as though it's a theater. And this theatrical element is visible in Exile of Gardel and also in his most recent film, Sur, where we have an emphasis on performance and creating a performance space within the film, which is very nicely done, I think, in Sur. Secondly, we have the whole theme of the slaughterhouses and cattle and the metaphor of cattle again in Sur, which is very powerfully depicted in Hour of the Furnaces. Yes. And we also have a certain political awareness of the difference here, in critical terms, between the experience of the working class in Argentina and those who could leave, the intellectuals who left. Oh. Because the protagonist of Sur is a worker in a slaughterhouse, and he is imprisoned. And of course, the film traces that whole experience of imprisonment, and it takes place within the night of his release. And so he's trying to get at working class consciousness from a different angle, which is not that of what we call panfletario, organizing, let's get the workers organized, but to try to talk about the human experience, subjectivity, desire.
Right.
And gender does come in there, of course. And I think he does it quite well. So he's talking more about fantasies and how private fantasies are linked to political fantasies in a much more effective way, I think, than they might have at that time.
Oh, that's interesting, because of course there is no interior life portrayed in Hour of the Furnaces.
Absolutely not.
Everything is seen in terms of the mass. Much of it's even quantified and,
Yes.
and theoretical. There is a certain, as I think you remarked earlier, there's even a voyeuristic quality to the fact that this camera from a traveling car catches these people or whatever. That's that's really quite interesting. Well, no, just wanted to go to Hector just for a moment about what comments you might have about this film retrospectively from the moment in the late 80s of Argentine history. I mean, what does it look like from this perspective now?
Well, in relation to that, while Catherine was saying just recently the sort of self-transformation of Solanas' self-transformation, I mean, which can be seen in his cinematographic production, it could parallel wonderfully Argentine society's self-transformation and the sort of social self-criticism of those years, which were years of I would say, wishful thinking or utopias, and the re-evaluation of a number of issues that Argentine society seems to be considering these days in a different way. Democracy among them, the respect for pluralism, civil liberties, and issues that, because of a number of reasons, were not part of Argentine tradition in a very strong way. And, it's clear that, I would say, Solanas' production reflects Argentine society's self-transformation. And
okay, well, that's a very good note for us to end on. I mean, linking a cinematographic career, a set of films, and the history of a country. If you would like more information about cinema then, cinema now, or about cinema studies, graduate or undergraduate, drop us a line. Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me give you that information again, okay? Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Well, Catherine, thank you for bringing your expertise about a very exciting and interesting tradition of documentary filmmaking. Hector, thank you for bringing your political expertise and your experience of the culture and the history of this very interesting place, Argentina. I hope always that, as always, that is, that our thought and discussion here leads you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. Thanks for joining us.